Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our ERA Roundtable and Legislative Update. We're going to go ahead and get started. So just to preface, the ERA recently had its 101st birthday just this past Sunday, which was the 101st anniversary of Alice Paul originally writing the Equal Rights Amendment. So young people have been at the forefront of the Equal Rights Amendment and the contemporary movement to finalize the ERA. Young people definitively have the most to gain, but also the most to lose from finalizing the ERA or the lack of action. So here today, we hope to highlight the narratives, stories, and work of young ERA organizers, while also providing a legislative update on the progress of the ERA in Congress, both the work of the Bush office as well as the work of the ERA caucus. So just right now, this week, we've celebrated the 101st anniversary of the ERA, but also the first anniversary of the first ever ERA caucus in Congress. The ERA caucus is co-chaired by Rep. Bush and Rep. Ayanna Pressley, and is led by Black women for the first time spearheading the ERA in Congress through a caucus. We're also celebrating the 1 year of the HJ Res 82 resolution, which demands the finalization of the ERA and the archivists solidify the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our lovely panelists who come from backgrounds of organizing and advocacy and youth movement and equal rights amendment spaces. So we have Arush, who is the policy advocate, and he's the organizer who currently serves as the National Federal Policy Director of the Young Feminist Party. In his role, he helps craft federal policy strategy, aids in the planning of lobby days, and works to keep his community informed about the Equal Rights Amendment and its many intersections. Arush is organized for accessible civic education in his home state of New Jersey and will soon be attending Stanford as a prospective sociology major. John Paul is a student at American University and the national spokesperson for the Sunrise Movement. Born and raised in Miami, Florida, JP's activism began after witnessing the government's response to a climate disaster leave his community members behind. Propelled into action, he has since organized for climate justice at institutional, local, and federal levels, engaging students, community members, unions, and elected officials. Carolyn Deal is a 13-year-old activist and community organizer from Maryland. In 2019, she founded an organization called the Yellow Roses, which is inspired by the women's suffrage movement. The Yellow Roses educates and inspires young people to take an active role in democracy, even when they're too young to vote. Since she was 9, Carolyn has organized annual community service projects and brought together hundreds of families with the goal of empowering youth by showing them the difference they can make in their community. And Claudia is a 19-year-old Congolese American who is mobilizing the youth-led feminist movement for the ERA. Through her passion and skill as a political organizer, she leads a diverse movement of over 14,000 young people as deputy executive director at the Young Feminist Party. Claudia and the Young People movement have collaborated with government leaders at the local, state, and federal level for direct actions, lobbies, to build a new generation of feminist organizers. She's an expert in gender, human rights, and foreign policy, and is a student at Barnard College in New York. So today we're going to have a discussion, and then hopefully we will be able to hear some remarks from Congresswoman Bush as well. But I do want to go ahead and get started in the legislative update on HJ Res 82. So since its introduction last year, we've received 124 co-sponsors on the piece of legislation, which is incredibly important because the piece of legislation the resolution calls directly for the archivist to publish the ERA. And finalize the constitutional equality of the 28th Amendment. Awesome. We're able to see Rep. Bush join. Hi, Rep. Bush. How are you? Good morning. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us.
Good morning. Good morning. Sorry for the delay. I was in an interview and it went over. Sorry.
All good, all good. I just introduced our panelists and I'm ready to have you kick us off here.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for putting this together. I'm so honored to join you all virtually for such an important roundtable discussion and legislative update on the Equal Rights Amendment. I would first like to thank our amazing panelists from the Young Feminist Party, Sunrise Movement, and the Yellow Roses for being here. These groups, of course, led by our youth, are bringing change forward, um, and dragging some folks along, which is great. Through your work and your organizing, your advocacy, you're carrying forward the work of the amazing Black and Brown advocates that have come before us, like Pauli Murray and Congresswoman Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. But they also, you are also forging a path, a new movement for the ERA that's rooted in our interconnectedness and intersectionality and justice for all people. This past Sunday, my 48th birthday, the ERA turned 101 years old. Let that sink in. 101 years old. It's older, and I've said this before, but it just always blows my mind. The ERA is older than penicillin. It's older than the ballpoint pen. It's older than the black and white television and even sliced bread. It is unacceptable that even after a century, we are still fighting for the inclusion of these 24 words in our Constitution. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Once enshrined in our Constitution, these 24 simple words have the power to deliver so many of the fundamental rights we are fighting for, including reproductive freedom, ending the gender wage gap, liberation for our queer and transgender communities, increasing gender equity in education, in healthcare, in housing, and so much more. What's truly remarkable about the ERA movement today is the leadership and the dedication of you all. You are the driving force behind this renewed push for equality. And I could not be more excited and proud. Know that while you all are on the ground, while you're organizing for the ERA, we have your back. You can always call us, let us know how to plug in. That's why we are introducing and advancing legislation that works toward finalizing the ERA in Congress. So as you're working, we're working in Congress. Last year, alongside my sister in service, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, we launched the first ever caucus for the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress. And it's just wild that 100 years, it took 100 years for a caucus. It took 100 years to give the ERA a home in the United States Congress. This caucus also makes a home for this youth-led movement on Capitol Hill and works to expand the number of members who are fighting for the ERA and who are fighting publicly. And in the year since it was launched, our caucus has become the fifth largest caucus in Congress with 83 members, which is amazing. Yes, that is the power of your work. That is the power of your organizing and your galvanizing. So be proud, you all. We were able to get 83 members in this caucus, becoming the fifth largest because of you. And so as extremists continue to chip away at rights and freedoms of communities like St. Louis, we cannot wait another moment to finalize the ERA and create these constitutional protections. That's why I introduced my ERA Now resolution alongside Senator Gillibrand, urging the Archivist of the United States to certify and publish the Equal Rights Amendment now. One signature. That's what we're asking for, one signature. But we know our work is far from over, especially because she hasn't done it yet. So as we continue to advocate for the ERA, it's crucial that we amplify the voices of our young leaders, especially our Black and Brown youth, bringing renewed energy to this fight. And it's important that we center all of you because it's you that will be the ones to ensure the ERA, once enshrined, is fully implemented and lives up to its promise to all people. Because remember, we know that once it's signed, there's that's a whole other level of work that has to take place to make sure that it is fully implemented. And so once again, to all our panelists, thank you. Your voices, your activism, your passion are reshaping the conversation and pushing us closer to seeing the 28th Amendment in the Constitution, the ERA. I look forward to this discussion and your legislative update.
Thank you so much, Rep Bush. So you are absolutely right. We have made some galvanizing progress in Congress and on the ground in the past year. I was just sharing the update that we now have 83 members of the Equal Rights Amendment Caucus. Like you mentioned, that's the fifth largest caucus in Congress because equality is overwhelmingly popular in Congress and on the ground. And that's one connection we'll be able to discuss is how you all have been able to find equality as a value that resonates in your communities and how we've been able to continue that progress and make sure that our leaders are outwardly and, like you said, publicly supporting equality in the Equal Rights Amendment. Our resolution that you introduced just 1 year ago has 124 sponsors. With a huge increase in the past few weeks, we've been able to gain over 30 new sponsors. So while the chaos is ensuing in other areas of our government, we know that we are going to keep chugging along towards equality and making sure that the ERA is finally finalized in the Constitution. So thank you so much for sharing your remarks. And to kick us off, because these organizers and leaders are exactly why we're here, is to hear from them. So I'm going to start with Claudia. And I have a question since we've been mentioning all the time, two-thirds of states have ratified the ERA and it's passed out of Congress. So why is the ERA still not in the Constitution?
Thank you so much for your question, Sam, and I'm so happy to be here. So in 2020, Virginia became the 38th last and final state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This, however, was after the congressionally imposed deadline on the Equal Rights Amendment a few decades ago. And because Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia were the last three states to ratify past the deadline. There have been legal scholars and appellate litigation that have resulted in such that because those states were the last ones to ratify after the deadline, the ERA is not valid. Therefore, the ERA has to have the deadline removed by Congress. And that's the resolution that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is carrying right now in the House, alongside with Senator Ben Cardin in the Senate. So that's a significant reason as to why the ERA actually isn't in the Constitution. I think an important thing to note is that the deadline that was imposed on the ERA wasn't included in the text of the ERA itself. It was included in the preamble of the ERA that was introduced in Congress, which is honestly acts more of like a suggestion for what should be happening to amendments. And because the states only vote on the text of the amendment itself, many legal scholars, including my coworkers at ERA Project at Columbia Law School, have argued that the deadline is not valid. It is a procedural hurdle that's been thrown in our faces to try and get away of our equality. It is something that conservatives have looked towards even today, saying the ERA is not valid and that it shouldn't be resurrected. But we know that's just not true. We know that the ERA is not valid, that the deadline is not valid, excuse me. We affirm the ERA is the 28th Amendment. Even very prominent constitutional legal scholars like Lawrence Tribe agree with that. Even Congressman Jamie Raskin himself has said that. And the only thing that's standing in the way of the ERA actually getting into the Constitution is POTUS and whether or not POTUS wants to take action and instruct the National Archivist to publish it into the Constitution as 28th Amendment. Now, of course, we have this congressional strategy where, okay, the courts have said that the ball is in Congress's court. So we're going to continue supporting both resolutions that are in Congress that are saying we're going to remove the deadline, but we're also going to affirm the ERA as a 28th Amendment and call upon POTUS to take action and instruct the National Archivist to do so. But as a young movement organization, a young feminist party, we're also going to continue putting pressure, on the executive branch to get it done. And we're going to continue mobilizing and organizing young people to put pressure on their congressional representatives to support those resolutions that are in Congress to get the ERA across the finish line.
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that, Claudia. And I think recently, as reproductive rights have become the forefront of what is a feminist issue and a voter issue across the board. We hear a lot of talks about restoring Roe and that type of rhetoric. Arush, could you speak a little bit to what the ERA would do in the wake of the Dobbs v. Jackson women's health decision for abortion rights at a federal level?
Yes, of course. And again, thank you so much for the question and for putting this together. I'm so excited to be here. So it may seem like common sense, although a handful of unelected judges maybe haven't caught wind of this fact quite yet, that abortion restrictions are sex discrimination. And that's just an unequivocal fact of what abortion restrictions are. And so some constitutional scholars go so far as to say that Dobbs would have to be reconsidered just because it's a major constitutional change so close to the delivery of that opinion. And it's important to recognize that Roe versus Wade was originally decided under the auspices of privacy. It was not litigated as a sex equality issue. So putting the ERA as the 28th Amendment in the Constitution would create a permanent legal and constitutional basis for the right to abortion in the law of the land. And again, we're not just left to theorizing about the impacts the ERA would have. We can look to the states. And a good example is the state of New Mexico. In post-Roe America, states like New Mexico serve as havens for other places like Texas that have strict abortion bans. And many other states send their abortion patients to New Mexico. And New Mexico has a state ERA. And their state level ERA was used to strike down their state version of the Hyde Amendment, which bars the use of federal or state funding for abortion procedures. In addition, New Mexico has no burdensome trap laws. Trap laws place unnecessary burdens on abortion providers and abortion hospitals. And this is all because they have a state ERA. So when we say that the ERA will protect abortion access, it is not hyperbole. And just recently, within the past year, we've seen two additional states come out against abortion restrictions. Nevada, which Sam is very familiar with, having led the movement to get Nevada to adopt their state level ERA, and Pennsylvania both struck down Hyde amendments at the state level on the basis of the Equal Rights Amendment. So we know the ERA works as a tool to protect abortion, and we know that if applied at the federal level, it will do the exact same and more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arush. And considering how pressing reproductive rights and abortion justice is for young people, Carolyn, you, like everyone on this panel, are a young person in America today. And I wanted you to speak to a little bit why the ERA is so important for young people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that young people really do have the most to gain and the most to lose from the ERA. And I know that they don't want to grow up into a world where they do not have equal rights under the law, which is basic common sense. And I think it really comes down to education about the ERA. And I have an organization, the Yellow Roses, and we do these things called voting rights story times. And every time that we did a story time, whether it was on the women's suffrage movement, the women's history, civil rights movement, it wasn't only the kids that were learning, it was the adults that were learning with them. And I think that goes to show that it is really important and that not a lot of people know these stories in this history. And, that's why I'm so glad we're here talking about this, because it's a really rare opportunity for young people to have a chance to be a part of a movement where they can see the change that they are fighting for in their lifetime. And it will really greatly affect them, in their everyday life. And so, like my mom says, the more we educate, the more we activate. And, we're so close. It's like we've come so far and we're just sitting and looking at the finish line. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And what's going to get us past the finish line is young people like you, like Claudia and Arush, and everyone from these feminist movements who are coming forward and really pushing the needle, because that's exactly what needs to be done. When we talk about how intergenerational the ERA movement is and how for the first time young people are at the forefront, it's really important to acknowledge that the ERA does not just mean gender equality, it means intersectional justice and social justice. And so we have John Paul from the Sunrise Movement as a climate justice organizer. And I wanted you to kind of clarify how the ERA connects to your organization's commitment to climate justice and why the ERA is so essential to achieving a world with a Green New Deal.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks so much to all the other great panelists. Samantha, you for putting this on, and Congressman Bush for your updates and presence. Yeah, I think that part of what makes the ERA so important and aligned with the vision of Sunrise Movement is that, I mean, fundamentally, what we're trying to strive towards is an economy and a country in which people are freer than they are right now. And that means free from corporations being able to own their rights over our breathable air and drinkable water, but also any politician in the pocket of any corporate interest who seeks to dominate and control people in any way. Part of the environmental ethic of how we conceptualize nature is actually, entirely a sort of like feminine icon that we in sort of the Western and industrialized world kind of perceive. Like whenever we think of nature, we do think of Mother Nature, and it's like really nice and all of that. But part of like the underlying thing there too is that we see nature as this thing that is external to us, which we can always sort of take for granted and not afford the same protections as we would otherwise someone else. And so there's sort of like a deep philosophical ethos there over how I think a lot of environmentalists think of feminism as a core part of what drives our credibility and our sort of founding ideals over the kind of world that we want to build. But also just on a simpler level, what we need to do over the next less than 10 years is overhaul our economy to take it from a dirty, polluting, unfair one to a clean, equitable, and caring one that works for all people and this planet that we're living on. And that's going to take a whole lot of work. It's going to take a mass mobilization of society to do. And the only way that that's going to work and the only way that that's actually going to be accomplished is if we do it fairly and treat everyone right in the process. As we talk about inspiring incredible amounts of work and jobs in restewarding our country to achieve net zero carbon emissions and just all around make this a better country for all people, we have to do it fairly. And what I think the ERA provides is literally a legal framework and a precedent to do just that. On top of just sort of the trajectory of what we need to do and doing it fairly, part of what the climate crisis does, part of what growing up in a warming world does, is exacerbate already existing conflicts, both the inequalities of workplace pay and the discrepancies that there are there, all the way down to gender-based violence. And part of what the ERA does in both a proactive way, but also in a preventative way, is establish forms of safety that can guide us to make this place a safer and more equitable world as we begin to transition towards a cleaner society. And so I do just absolutely feel committed to a vision of intersectionality across our movements, because ultimately what we're fighting for is a freer, equitable world that we seek to be building right now with the institutions that we have. And the ERA is an incredible framework of how to do that.
Absolutely. I really wanted to highlight what you touched on about creating a framework for justice. So the Equal Rights Amendment, we've talked about its connection to abortion, but also intersectional justice, that when we talk about climate injustice and a warming planet, women and marginalized people will experience and do experience the worst of the harms of these types of injustices and disasters. And the Equal Rights Amendment provides explicit framework to guarantee that our climate solutions prioritize the most marginalized. And so I'm jumping back a little bit. I know, Arush, you mentioned a little bit about state ERAs and how they provide a really great framework for understanding the implications and protections that a federal ERA would potentially provide. Could you speak a little bit about what the difference between state ERAs are and the 28th Amendment?
Yeah, of course. So I think the most fundamental difference is state ERAs only govern within the states that they are passed in. The federal ERA, the 28th Amendment, would apply to all the states. And it's interesting. I think recently we've had a lot of states come out with ballot measures for equal rights amendments. I'm going to go back to Nevada as a really good example of that. But also New York State is considering its own equal rights amendment this coming election. And in both of those examples, their ERA is superficially a lot more expansive than the proposed federal ERA. Those ERAs explicitly mention a list of protected categories, including race, nationality, creed, sexual orientation, gender identity. The federal ERA only mentions that it would ban discrimination on the basis of sex. So, in that sense, state ERAs have the potential to be more overarching and more explicit than the federal ERA. But I think a really good analogy for it is the minimum wage. There is a federal minimum wage, and states are empowered to go beyond the federal standard. But the federal standard is the minimum standard that states must adhere to. So that's why state ERAs are super important. And a lot of the recent wins that we've been seeing come as a result of states being empowered to pass their own ERAs and voters being empowered to start ballot initiatives to see constitutional sex equality in their states. But we need a federal standard so that interstate disparities in, for example, abortion access don't widen. For example, going back to the example of New Mexico, the fact that patients from other states have to go to New Mexico to access medical care is outstanding, and it is, quite frankly, depressing. And I think that speaks to the need for a federal amendment, the 28th Amendment, so that all states are on the same level playing field in terms of access to things like abortion and other examples of sex equality.
Thanks for that explanation, Arush. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing when the ERA is used interchangeably, and I really appreciate the comparison to minimum wage. And so again, you mentioned abortion, and speaking a little bit to St. Louis, Missouri, and the district that our office represents, I had a question for Claudia about how would the ERA impact St. Louis, Missouri, and other states directly impacted by extreme restrictions to abortion care, and particularly the women of color that are most harmed by these extreme restrictions, like those in St. Louis.
Yes, of course. So when we think about the average profile of a person seeking abortion, it is a young woman of color in her 20s, who likely already has other children, and 50% of those women live below the federal poverty line. An additional 25% are just scraping by right above it. So we know that abortion restrictions unduly burden women, but especially women of color, young women of color. And when we took a look at the demographic of St. Louis, we see that there is a large Black and Brown population there. So when we think about how these bans and restrictions on abortions play out and have an undue burden on these women of color, in addition to what that means for the Equal Rights Amendment, we see that the Equal Rights Amendment would address those intersectional issues when it comes to gender and race. And not a lot of people understand that, especially today, because in the 70s, the ERA was very much framed as almost a quote unquote white women's movement. Which is absolutely not true. There are plenty of women of color like Shirley Chisholm, for example, and Polly Murray that did pioneering leadership on the 70s feminist ERA movement. However, the ERA hasn't always been envisioned to protect the most marginalized women in our society. Now, a significant part of why there is the big shift in how we think about the ERA today is because legal scholars are actively envisioning that the ERA will be interpreted with substantive equality jurisprudence. Now, that's a shift from how the Supreme Court typically looks at discrimination cases when it comes to equality in suspect classes. Substantive equality recognizes the fact that a person can hold more than one one identity, which are inextricably tied. And all of those factors compound the discrimination and the injustice they feel. Therefore, they cannot be separated or dissected from one another when we're taking a look at how a person experiences discrimination on the basis of their sex. So, a Black woman, for example, Black women in St. Louis, under the Equal Rights Amendment, aren't going to be able to bring their cases forward with a court that decides to only see them as women and not Black women. We see it very clearly that race and class and gender collude with each other in ways that make it very difficult for this demographic to succeed in life. So I think when it comes to majority minority populations, especially like what we see in St. Louis, the ERA would have such immense benefits in ways that we've never even seen with this Supreme Court, even under its formal equality jurisprudence. And when we take a look, more broadly at abortion protections, a substantive equality jurisprudence would certainly give more strength to those abortion restrictions and protections. When we take a look at Pennsylvania, for example, they recently had a case, the Allegheny decision, that was able to protect abortion because abortion restrictions on Medicaid coverage were trying to be prohibited by the state legislature. And the decision essentially just struck that down. The court said that this violates Pennsylvania's state equal rights amendment. And the decision put that in very explicit language. And we see that Pennsylvania was a state that ratified its state ERA in response to ongoing struggles from federal battles that were trying to conceptualize and protect women's rights, but in ways that kept failing. So we see that even when we're taking a look at the legislative history and how people are conceptualizing what an ERA means and what an ERA is supposed to protect, that gives so much more power to what a federal ERA could do. Even when you're trying to take a traditionalist or a textualist approach to many of these issues, the same way that our far right conservative Supreme Court justices do. They'll often say, well, when the Constitution was ratified or when this amendment was ratified, the framers and the public didn't intend for it to protect such and such. However, we know that because the ERA was ratified in 2020, and we were saying that the ERA is supposed to protect queer rights, it's supposed to protect trans rights, it's supposed to be interpreted with a substantive equality lens, it's supposed to protect abortion and reproductive rights, we are actively building the legislative history as activists, as lawmakers, as government officials, as people, as to how the ERA would actually impact our lives in a way that we're not going to let conservative Supreme Court justices like Arush said that are unelected to determine what the ERA means. Now, of course, we continue to fight those battles. And I think it's important that in the meantime, while we're building that movement for the federal ERA, we take action at the state level. And that means supporting state level abortion ballot initiatives and bringing those people into the ERA movement, supporting state level ERA initiatives. There's one going on in New York State right now that will also explicitly add abortion to its amendment language. All of that work is so important for building the legislative history of what the ERA means and how we want it to be interpreted, at the federal level when we win the federal ERA. And I will also note, which is very important, not every state has the option to enshrine abortion rights in their constitutions. Not every state has the option to start ballot initiatives and referendums. Texas, for example, doesn't have that option. While Ohio enshrined abortion rights in its state constitution not so long ago, there are millions of Americans that won't even be able to pursue those avenues of action. And that's why it's so much more important that we make sure that while we're building state power for the federal ERA, we need to make sure that we have this bigger vision in mind, that this isn't just about the states, it's about the entire country.
Thank you, Claudia. I love the idea that all of your activism is triggering this type of legislative history that will be used when we win the ERA. So, speaking to this legislative history and the activism that fuels it, Carolyn, I just want to ask, how did you get involved in the ERA? What brought you to the ERA when you came in around the centennial year of the Equal Rights Amendment? What is it about the ERA that compels you to continue organizing and get involved in this movement?
So I started the Yellow Roses when I was 9. And I was just learning about the women's rights movement, about the women's suffrage movement. And I was like so inspired and so empowered by all of these stories. And I wanted to like create a platform where I could talk to other kids about it and I could teach other people about all that, how long women have fought and how hard they fought for just the right to vote. And I think that a lot of parents tell their girls that they can do whatever they want to do, they can be whatever they want to be. But when in reality they grow up, they come into the real world and they don't have protection, they don't have control over their body, their boss is legally allowed to pay their male counterparts more than them, and that under the Constitution they aren't mentioned. In the basis of our democracy, they don't even say the word woman at all. And I think that, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But it really is the youth that have the most to gain. And now that we have the ERA so close to the finish line, we have President Biden in office for just this short amount of time, that we need to show the leaders that the youth want it. We need to get it done now, and we really need to protect our future. With the ongoing threats of the conservative government and Project 2025, and that it really is so important.
You're so right, Carolyn. Thank you. And finally, I just want to go around because we've talked to everyone, because we've talked about the ERA as a movement and the ERA as our future. But what can we do as organizers, as members of Congress, and as people coming at the ERA from all different walks of life, different ages, and different backgrounds to make the Equal Rights Amendment and make the ERA a household name across the finish line? So we'll start with Arush.
Yeah, so I think as young people and as activists, I can't vote yet. I'm only 17, but this will be the first election I'm able to vote. There's so many things that you can do even if you can't vote. And I think Carolyn can speak a lot more to that. But constituent pressure is powerful. And I think last year we got for the first time a floor vote on a piece of ERA legislation in I think 75 years. And that happened because activists and youth movements put consistent pressure on Senate leadership, on Senate Majority Leader Schumer, to bring that legislation to a floor vote on the Senate. So reach out to your representatives, reach out to your senators. These are small actions that you can take that can have a profound and tangible impact. And again, for members of Congress, I think Congresswoman Bush has been leading the way and as an exemplar of how Congress people can be allies to young people and can be responsive to young people's movements. I think just listening to us, being receptive to our ideas, not discounting us because we can't vote or because we don't have a certain degree. I think that is super important. And I think YFP is going to be on the Hill in just a week from yesterday. And we're going to show our representatives and our elected officials that we have people power and they need to listen to us as their constituents.
Thank you, John Paul.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. I think that pressure does absolutely work. And I think that sometimes you have to create the moral urgency needed to force decision makers to act. And there's a variety of ways in which that can be done. It can be done through phone calls and text messages and emails to offices. It can be done through the protagonism of actions, sort of targeting institutions to do what needs to get done. It also looks like talking to everyday people who trust, right? It can be hard to sometimes approach other folks and change public opinion only by using the levers of media, which people sometimes don't entirely trust, or an avenue of politics that people aren't entirely convinced by. But all of us have immense amount of trust and love with the communities that we form a part of. And being able to balance those two things, sort of public and civic agitation and moral urgency, with also tugging at the hearts and minds of those that we love and love us, is a dual track way of, I think, really making positive change.
Of course, I think when we talk about the ERA, oftentimes, as Claudia mentioned, there's this false notion that it has already passed. People might already be in the Constitution. Your rights are not there. There's not a gap in what's codified, or the ERA movement is a little bit archaic or obsolete. And I think with young people at the forefront, we need to make the ERA a household name and need to make it central for the progressive movement and for progressives and people across the political spectrum, that equality is popular, and the ERA as an acronym needs to be known and recognized. So Carolyn, do you want to speak a little bit more about that?
I mean, I think it really is just preaching the message that equality knows no age, and your voice is just as powerful as a kid as it is as an adult. And we need to make kids feel empowered and believed in and listened to. And kids have phones. I made my first phone calls for a political candidate when I was 6 years old. So you can do it from any age, and I think lawmakers will really listen if you have all of the ages, all of the generations standing up to fight the cause. I've been to many Equal Rights Amendment rallies with my grandparents and with my mom and with my siblings. So if you simple it down and just give the information to people, they will feel how urgent it is, and they will understand and really come out for the cause.
Great. And Claudia, how do you think we can make the ERA a household name?
I think that it starts with movements. I think that when we think about, especially on the progressive left, what it looks like to have a more just, inclusive future in this country, especially, we have to start thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment and championing it as a solution to so many of the feminist issues that we're grappling with today, whether that's trans rights, whether that's queer rights, whether that's, women's rights, etc. The ERA has to be seen as that avenue, as that permanent legal protection in our nation's most foundational document to address these issues. We can't just be talking about, WIPA or the EACH Act as an avenue to secure abortion and reproductive rights of this country. Federal laws will not be enough to secure these rights that we want, because federal laws are contingent upon shifting majorities and political tides within this country. If the Senate turns red, if the House turns red, if we have a president in the Oval that's, also red, those rights can be very easily taken away. I think that it starts with movement organizations. I think people, within the Sunrise Movement and other big Gen Z organizations have to start looking at, groups like the Young Feminist Party that are doing this work day in and day out, and they're putting in the effort, they're making strides, they're organizing young people, they're doing it in their local communities, they're doing it in Congress, they're doing it in the White House, they're doing it at the courts, they're doing so much. And I think that when we're trying to work meaningfully in coalition with each other, we need to make sure that we're deferring to the groups that have consistently been doing this work and that are actively envisioning and theorizing and taking action on what the ERA is actually going to protect. And when it comes to elected officials and leaders, I'll make one note. The number one goal of an elected official is to get reelected. They're going to run on issues that are popular to their voters, that are popular to their constituents, to make sure that they stay in office. We know right now that a big central issue that many voters care about, especially when they're liberal, is abortion, reproductive rights. We can't have candidates that are consistently running on a very, I would say, vague concept of quote unquote restoring Roe v. Wade, or I'm going to vote for Whipper, I'm going to vote for the Each Act, because we know that's not enough. We know that the Equal Rights Amendment is a viable, proven solution to do just that. But if their constituents aren't talking about the ERA as a solution, if youth movements aren't talking about the ERA as a solution, they're not going to know it's a solution. Even if these members of Congress have, co-sponsored whatever bill is in the ERA, at the present moment. I've talked to some of these members of Congress that were like, oh, I thought that was already in the Constitution. It's very clear that even when they put their name on things, they don't necessarily realize the impact of the ERA. So we need to make sure that not only are these members of Congress signing their names on things, they're becoming champions. And that begins with movements, bringing it to the table and showing them this is what we want. And I need you to be a vocal supporter about it.
Thank you, Claudia. Equality is popular. We've known this. It's been proven that equality is popular in states across the country, in states like Nevada that recently passed the most recent passage of a state ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment passed at a higher rate than any candidate on the ballot, and that's because equality is popular. And we have waited 101 years for this amendment, and we will not wait. We will not wait one more. The time is now to codify the 28th Amendment in our Constitution. And I want to thank you all so much for your brilliance and your time today, but also your time and energy in perpetuity, where you are constantly organizing and doing everything you can to finalize the Equal Rights Amendment. Because what we're doing now and this organizing that's happening, as Rep. Bush mentioned, both on the ground and in Congress, is working together in step to ensure that equality is built from the ground up, and that we will have equality for everyone permanently in the Constitution forever. So thank you all so much for joining us today, for your time, and to all our panelists for sharing their wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for organizing this, Samantha. Thank you so much to the office of Congresswoman Cori Bush for always being just amazing pioneers and activists, and a movement office for the Equal Rights Amendment and so many young progressive activists.
Yes, thank you so much. Echoing everything Claudia said.
Of course, and for everyone watching, you know how to contact the office and stay involved with the Equal Rights Amendment, and connect with organizations like the Yellow Roses, the Young Feminist Party, and Sunrise Movement to stay involved.